Hi, everyone. Welcome, Club Z families, parents, teens, alumni, staff, faculty, friends. We are very, very lucky to have with us today Colonel Richard Kemp, who offered his expertise and time. He's live from Tel Aviv right now. It's very late for him, so thank you so much. We are letting people in, but I want to really briefly give a high overview of who we are sitting with. Colonel Richard Kemp has spent most of his life fighting terrorism, insurgency. He was a British commanding officer in Afghanistan. He spends so much of his time today fighting and standing up for Israel, for the Jewish people. He's a great friend to Club Z. He spent 2 weeks with Club Z teens this summer in our inaugural Israel trip. And wrote 2 fantastic pieces about it. And I encourage all of you to read Colonel Kemp's piece. Now, with us today, he is here to brief us on what is happening in Israel in terms of the latest conflict with Gaza. I don't want to take too much time. I'm going to pass it over to Colonel Kemp, where he's going to brief us, and then we are going to do a Q&A. So with all over to you, Colonel Kemp.
Thank you for your introduction. I'm still trying to recover from my 2 weeks with Club Z, but I've just about got over it. It was a rough ride, but there you go. I don't know if anyone who was on the trip is here, but if you are, then good to see you all again. I'm going to, as Naya said, I'm going to spend about 10, maybe 15 minutes talking about this conflict that's been going on. And a few perspectives on it from me, and then I'll take any questions that anyone wants to ask. Essentially, the conflict began on Thursday afternoon with an Israeli precision airstrike into Gaza, and it ended last night at about 23:30 with a ceasefire that was brokered by Egypt. And since 23:50, there hasn't been any rockets fired into Israel so far. Who knows whether it will be more in the coming hours or days, but so far the ceasefire is holding. To understand this conflict, which was very unusual because it was the first of the Gaza conflicts that Israel has initiated by a preemptive attack. In all other cases, Israel has responded to attacks from Gaza, so it's a different ballgame in some ways, and very much unexpected by most experts, I think, who I've discussed it with. To understand the conflict, we've got to go back a little bit, back to about May last year. And if you remember, in May last year, there was a large-scale conflict lasting about 11 days between Hamas and Israel. And after that, Palestinian-Islamic Jihad, which is a kind of the second biggest terrorist group in Gaza, began to intensify their operations in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. I believe Jews come from Judea, so I've been told anyway, but there's some terrorists there as well. And the terrorist attacks, the terrorist operations there were building up since, as I say, since May last year, and resulted in quite significant attacks towards the end of last year and early this year. Led by Palestinian-Islamic Jihad, with other groups involved as well. And the IDF launched an operation called Operation Breakwater with the Shin Bet, the Internal Security Agency, a few months back, and rounded up quite a lot of terrorists in the West Bank. And at the same time, there was a further intensification between, you may recall, between April and May of this year. About, I think, 19 Israelis were killed by these terrorists, and Israel intensified its effort to clamp them down. So part of that effort was to arrest a guy called Bassem al-Sadi, who was the leader of Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the West Bank. And his arrest took place last Monday. And of course, there was a great outcry from Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza, which led to them trying to carry out attacks on Israelis across the border from Gaza by anti-tank weapons. And the place, those of us who were in Israel recently will remember being at Black Arrow, where we overlooked the Gaza border. And that sort of area was one of the targets for the attacks. So the IDF on Tuesday, the day after the arrest of Bassem al-Sadi, they pretty much closed all the roads around the border and the railway line because they weren't able to identify the location of where the attack was going to take place. So the only way to prevent it was to stop movement within sight of anti-tank missiles, which is what they did. And then on Tuesday, sorry, that occurred on Tuesday, the closure of those roads. And then on Thursday, the IDF decided to carry out a strike against the people planning to carry out the attack into Gaza. And that was led by a guy called Taysir al-Jabari, who was the leader of Palestinian Islamic Jihad in northern part of the west of Gaza. So they carried out an airstrike on him and killed him. And they also killed an anti-tank team that was moving to try and carry out these attacks. So they got hard intelligence. It's not just threats from Palestinian Islamic Jihad, as the media have reported. It's hard intelligence on these attacks, which is why Israel launched a preemptive strike. So that strike occurred on Thursday afternoon. And then Thursday evening, beginning at 9:00 p.m., Palestinian Islamic Jihad began launching missiles at Israel, large numbers of missiles. And between 9:00 on Thursday last week, 9 p.m. Thursday, and around about just before midnight last night, they launched 1,100 missiles towards Israel. 1,100, it's quite a significant number in a short time. Approximately 990 of those rockets crossed the border into Israel. And approximately 200, just under a quarter, landed in the Gaza Strip. So they didn't get into Israel, they landed inside the Gaza Strip. 380 of the rockets that entered Israel were intercepted. And most of the remainder landed in open areas, because as you probably know, Iron Dome will only intercept missiles that it calculates are going to land in populated areas. It doesn't waste interceptors on missiles that are not going to land in the desert. So that's what they did. And there was damage to buildings and vehicles, quite significant damage in some cases. Majority of the missiles were fired in the towns around the Gaza Strip, like Sderot and Ashkelon and various other towns around there. But some were also aimed at Jerusalem. They didn't actually get to Jerusalem. Quite a large number were aimed at Tel Aviv. Again, they didn't get there. They were intercepted overhead. And also Modin and other towns in central Israel. They were also targeted, but none of them were hit. The IDF claimed that approximately 96% success rate for Iron Dome, which is a better success rate than previous operations. So that occurred. The IDF struck 170 Palestinian Islamic Jihad and other terrorist targets in Gaza from the land, from the air, and from the sea, destroying military posts and compounds, launch points, weapons storage facilities, rocket launch pits, an attack tunnel that hadn't actually been completed under the Gaza border, but was intended to be. They destroyed that. They killed Taysir Jabari, who I mentioned, who was the leader of Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the north, and also Khaled Mansour, who was the southern commander for Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So they basically decapitated the Islamic Jihad in two strikes. These were the two most senior Islamic Jihad commanders in the Gaza Strip. Just a couple of other points on casualties. First of all, during the conflict, no Israelis were killed by Islamic Jihad rockets or any other munitions. 3 people, maybe a bit more than 3, but 3 to my knowledge, were lightly wounded, including 2 IDF soldiers and a civilian who were wounded by a mortar attack. In Gaza, the IDF estimates, and it's not 100% confirmed at the moment, they estimate a total of 48 people killed in Gaza during the conflict. Of those, the IDF killed 20 Islamic Jihad terrorists. They also say they believe they killed approximately 7 uninvolved civilians. And I mean, we can go into that in Q&A if you want, but of course, when you've got this sort of conflict where terrorists are firing from within human shields, within populated areas, then the deaths of civilians, even no matter how much the IDF try and avoid them, are unavoidable. And what, contrary again to what you might hear in the media, incidental deaths like that, which are unavoidable, are not illegal. They will be described by people as being war crimes and illegal, but they're not. It's not illegal to kill civilians as long as you don't deliberately target them, and as long as you take as many measures as you can to avoid them. The IDF estimate that 14 individuals in Gaza were killed by Islamic Jihad rocket attacks that fell short, that didn't go into Israel and landed in Gaza. So that's 14, which is more, twice as many as were killed by uninvolved civilians who were killed by Israel. There's a further 5 to 7 deaths that have been identified, but their cause is not known, and the IDF is investigating what the causes are, and also the number of wounded are not known. While this was going on, the IDF and Shabak were carrying out arrest operations against PIJ, Islamic Jihad, in the West Bank, and they arrested at least 19 overnight on the 5th and 6th. You may have seen that there were a number of civilians, a number of uninvolved people, including children, 4 children, killed in an explosion inside the Gaza Strip in a place called Jabalia. And that, of course, the media immediately leapt on that and said it was the IDF's, an IDF strike. But very quickly after it became news, the IDF... there was a bit of interference there. As soon as it was reported, pretty much, the IDF confirmed that they had not carried out a strike there, and they had conclusive photographic and radar proof that this was one of the rockets that was launched by Hamas, by Islamic Jihad, and fell short of Israel and landed in a populated area, Jabalia. So that, and although media reports saying that it was Israel have not been retracted, I think the media are going to find it very hard to try or to succeed in proving that it was Israel. It was undoubtedly a rocket that didn't land where it should have done. So just to sum up, those are the events. Just to sum up a few points. First of all, this was a major victory for Israel. They decapitated Islamic Jihad, and they caused severe damage to their munitions, to their facilities, to their headquarters, and to their fighters, killing quite a large number of fighters. Islamic Jihad and other groups that were involved in the attack claim that they had victory, that they won effectively. They've claimed that in the media, but actually they achieved nothing. The only thing they achieved was to send a large number of Israelis into bomb shelters, into rocket shelters over the last couple of days. They tried to target Ben Gurion Airport, didn't succeed, and didn't really disrupt air traffic in and out. And the only other real effect, I think, in Israel was maybe a slight dip in tourists coming out, because tourists tend to get a bit nervous when there's a war going on. But I suspect that's not going to be hugely significant. The other point I think that is significant is that Hamas, the major terrorist group that controls Gaza, did not join the attacks. And you may wonder why that was. And I think there are a number of reasons. One, because Egypt pressured Hamas not to join, and Egypt do listen to Hamas do listen to what Egypt said. Secondly, they weren't ready for another round. They're still trying to repair some of the damage that was caused in May last year, and weren't ready to do it again. And thirdly, I think they were quite happy to see Islamic Jihad smashed about by Israel, because they're rivals in the Gaza Strip and they're uncontrollable by Hamas. So I think they were happy to see Israel give them a good smashing. And I think the only other comment, two other comments. One is that the ceasefire was arranged by Egypt predominantly. There were other countries involved as well, but mainly it was Egypt negotiating between Israel and Islamic Jihad to achieve a ceasefire. And finally, just to emphasize a point, that Islamic Jihad is a proxy of Iran. It's funded by Iran, it's directed by Iran. The leader of Islamic Jihad was in Iran. The overall leader, who's normally based in Damascus, was in Tehran when this occurred. And there's no question, they've admitted it themselves, that they are a proxy of Iran. So this is not some, little tiny freedom fighter group fighting for their country. This is Iran using this group as an attack weapon against Israel. That's really pretty much all I need to say, but I'm happy to take whatever questions you might have.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to open it up to the audience for Q&A. And the first person that I see with a raised hand is Joshua Washington. So Joshua, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Colonel Kemp, for this debrief. Really appreciate it. I have a two-layered question, or I guess just two different questions. One is that do you have any information on? I've been seeing some things about not just Palestinians in Gaza celebrating the rockets, but some Arab Israelis actually living in Israel celebrating rockets coming into Israel.
Sorry, go on.
No. So yeah, that's my first, and then my second question is about Iran. You were just saying at the end. So if that is true, then what does that mean for Iran and our relationship, meaning the U.S.'s relationship to Iran, and yeah.
You're right. I've also seen, I haven't witnessed it personally, but I've also seen reports of Arab Israelis inside Israel celebrating attacks coming in. One thing to note, though, is that we haven't seen what we saw in May, which was an uprising. If you remember, we went to Lod and we talked to a woman who tried to justify the Arab uprising in May last year. We haven't seen anything like that. And I think it's because that uprising in May was provoked by Hamas, and Hamas were trying to keep out of this and didn't provoke anything similar this time around. So I think that's a plus. In terms of how it affects the negotiations, the nuclear negotiations, I don't think it will affect it at all. It's absolutely insanity. It's absolute insanity to continue negotiating with a country that's proxy is attacking one of your closest allies. But that's what's happening. And I don't think this will have any effect whatsoever. The US and other countries involved in the negotiations have been well aware of Iran's involvement in Gaza, in Judea and Samaria, and in other parts of the Middle East, and just don't want to know about it. They just want this nuclear deal.
Okay, we have now, I don't know who was first, but two gentlemen who have the same last name, Kasanovsky. I'll have the father go. So Greg, please, the floor is yours. Just unmute yourself.
Yes. Thank you, Colonel Kemp. So, that was very thorough. One question I have from news this morning is that there are reports that as part of ceasefire, Israel promised to actually release this operative Assadi, who was arrested a week ago. And Israel is kind of denying it in a coy way that his detention is going to be reviewed like all other administrative detentions. I mean, this is clearly a leader involved in planning terrorist operations. So do you have any knowledge whether Israel is actually intending to release him or not?
I don't know. I know it was part of the discussions when the negotiations occurred, and Islamic Jihad insisted on that. And I think Egypt gave them a kind of assurance, but I'm not sure that Israel agreed to it. But what I do know is that the Prime Minister of Israel said a few days ago that he would not be dictated to by terrorists about who he should and shouldn't arrest. So I hope he's as good as his word and does hold on to that man who, if he's released, will undoubtedly re-engage in activities to kill Israelis. So the answer is I don't know, but it's obviously a possibility. It could have been part of the deal.
Okay. Thank you, Colonel Kemp.
Jacob.
Yeah, so I know that ceasefire is recent, and it feels kind of light, like it might not stick or hold even into the next week. Should this war be prolonged, what type of effects could it, push on the Palestinian and the Israeli people in general, more than it has so far?
I think, I mean, certainly in discussions I've had with the IDF today, they don't believe that Islamic Jihad will start hostilities again. Of course, they don't know either way, but they don't believe that they will. And my guess is that they probably won't, because they have been very badly knocked around. They achieved nothing. They know, whatever they say, they know they achieved nothing. And you know, I suspect there's so much pressure on them from Egypt and from Qatar, which also has influence and does fund Islamic Jihad. I suspect that they will probably not do so, but we simply don't know. If they do recommence, then Israel will go back to their operations and continue to smash the hell out of them in the Gaza Strip, and the losers will be Islamic Jihad again. And I suspect that if that does occur, that Hamas is unlikely to get involved, which would obviously escalate the situation a lot. So that's purely guesswork, but I'm thinking it's probably not going to restart.
Okay, the next person is Joshua G. If you could please unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah. So you kept on mentioning it was Egypt who helped broker the deal. So why was it Egypt? Why does Egypt have this big influence?
Great, that's another question that somebody else had as well. So that's a great question, Joshua.
It's a good question, Joshua, as I'd expect from someone of your stature. But Egypt does have influence, and it has influence partly because it controls the southern border of Gaza, and you know it's a major regional player, and it can make life extremely difficult if it chooses to for Islamic Jihad and for Hamas. So that, you know, they're an influential player, and of course Egypt is interested in avoiding conflict on its doorstep, because the kind of conflict we've seen also affects Egypt. Egypt aren't targeted, but Egypt has their own Islamic terrorist problem within their borders, and you tend to get spillover from there. Plus, Egypt would have been under enormous pressure from the US to do what it could to bring about the end of it. The fact that Egypt doesn't want things to happen doesn't mean they won't, and that you know, they can't force Islamic Jihad or Hamas to follow their instructions, but they are influenced by them.
Okay, Odin, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you again, Colonel Kemp, for being here. I'm just curious. It seems like militarily, Israel, as you said, have been knocking around Islamic Jihad so well. Why would it agree to a ceasefire? Like, if it's going to potentially have to go up against Iran in the near future to take out its nuclear facilities, and Islamic Jihad is a proxy of Iran, why doesn't Israel just take the advantage and weaken Islamic Jihad right now as much as it possibly can? What does it have to lose if it kept an operation going? And is it worth it, in your opinion, that it's as a ceasefire?
Yes, good question. I think there's a number of reasons for it. One is because, you know, something like 1 million Israelis have been spending a lot of time in the last 2 or 3 days in bomb shelters, and they don't want that to continue. Of course, as you know, those people who spend their life going in and out of bomb shelters aren't happy, and the government doesn't want to see that go on. Secondly, they closed the Eretz crossing, which is the crossing point between Israel and Gaza that we visited. If you recall, those people were on the trip in Israel. We visited and gave food, etc., to Israeli soldiers there at the Eretz crossing. That was closed because in the last conflict, when it was open for humanitarian reasons, Hamas attacked it with rockets and severely wounded and killed people there. So they didn't want that to remain open and exposed to attack from Islamic Jihad. And the problem with that is that it then creates a potential humanitarian disaster inside Gaza, because fuel, the Gaza power plant was actually shut down in the last couple of days because no fuel could get through to it. And that, of course, affects hospitals, etc., and many other humanitarian concerns inside Gaza. And, you know, you might say, well, and it would be legal to carry on in those circumstances. It's not illegal to do that, to not do that. But, you know, Israel is also mindful of the pressures that it's under from internationally when it carries on like that, and if there's an offer of a ceasefire by the other side, then Israel's under great pressure from the US and from other countries to go with a ceasefire, and it normally does that when there is a ceasefire. But I can see your point. I think there would be merit perhaps in further smashing Islamic Jihad about, but they've done a great deal of damage to them already, and how much more damage they would do, we don't know. We can't say. The reality is that Israel also doesn't want to expend unnecessary military effort into Gaza, because it's, as you mentioned, that there's a possibility of it having to strike Iran, and it needs to conserve some of its effort to do that. It's a huge undertaking to attack Iran if it decides to do so, and it needs all the power it's got. And the other thing I think Israel knows is if it carried on, then there's every possibility, particularly if there was a major incident involving a large number of civilian deaths, that Hamas would join in as well, and then we'd be back to a much more protracted conflict. And this situation is not going to be ended by simply degrading these terrorists. Israel's degraded them again and again and again, and again and again and again they come back.
If I may, I'd like to just, I see another person's hand, but I want to just take a few steps back and zoom out just a bit. Myself, I had never heard of Islamic Jihad until this recent conflict. In fact, in my head, when I think of a proxy with Iran, I think of Hezbollah and I think of Hamas. How many Islamic terrorist organizations are there that actively work against the state of Israel? How many are there? Because this was my first time hearing of this terrorist organization. And then my follow-up question is, why not use Hezbollah? Why is Iran using PIJ? Why not tap into Hezbollah?
Well, Hezbollah is there up in the north in Lebanon. It also has a presence in Gaza and in Judea and Samaria as well. But it's up there in the north with its most of its military effort, getting ready to attack Israel with its 100,000, 200,000 rockets in southern Lebanon. If Israel attacks Iran, that's what they're for. And frankly, they don't need to use Hezbollah at the moment. They've got their other proxies like Islamic Jihad, their main one, Hamas, which is also funded to an extent by Iran, but is not a proxy in quite the same way as Islamic Jihad. They're not controlled as closely as Islamic Jihad is. There are plenty of other groups. There are numerous other groups, PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, DFLP, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which was also, all of those organizations have been involved in this. And Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade is linked to Fatah, in other words, the faction of the Palestinian Authority that controls Judea and Samaria, or parts of. So there's a list as long as your arm. Some of them are effective. The most effective are Hamas and Islamic Jihad. The others are less so, but will get stuck in when they can. And some of them fired rockets. All of the ones I mentioned fired rockets at Israel during this conflict. So it's a patchwork, it's a network, and Iran has a vast number of jihadist proxies, not just in this area, but around the Middle East, in places like in Syria, in Iraq, in Libya, in Yemen, and many other places. And all of them are controlled and funded by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is part of the Iranian government.
Wow, okay. A lot. Okay, I'm gonna, the next three are Club Z teens: Robert Vine, Shayna Levin, and Max Kaminsky. So Robert, Shayna, and Max. Robert, take it away. Robert? Okay, Shayna.
Hi, so
Yeah, can I have 1 second?
All right, Robert, you're back. So Shayna, mute yourself for a sec. Back to Robert. Robert, please speak up.
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I was just getting onto a train. This is also sort of a little bit not specific to this conflict, but I know that Wahhabism was sponsored early on a lot by Saudi Arabia, and they're a different sort of, and they're different than different branch of Islam. Do you think that, do you still see influences in Islamic Jihad or in Hamas of Wahhabist tendencies? Do you think the movement influenced them?
Yeah, but yes, they do. I mean, Wahhabism has influence in many of these organizations, but Saudi Arabia, since it was where Wahhabism was effectively founded and has been spread from. But Saudi Arabia has taken a different turn now. The ruler of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, is a different beast from what we've seen before there, and he's trying to clamp down on this. He certainly would not have, as far as I know, would not have had any influence behind these attacks or indeed any other attacks against Israel. In fact, he was to a large extent behind the Abraham Accords. Although Saudi hasn't signed up to the Abraham Accords, they would not have happened without a green light from Saudi Arabia. So the Wahhabism is around the world and is influencing huge number of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, like the Islamic State. But Saudi, as far as I know, and we can never be sure what goes on behind the scenes, is not got its hands on this, is not trying to spread it, it's trying to actually clamp down now.
Thank you. And now Shayna, as you know from our Club Z trip, Shayna.
Hi, so thank you for taking the time to speak to us, Colonel. I wanted to ask, since the PIJ broke the ceasefire already, how can Israel strike back and not show weakness while simultaneously maintaining good PR with the other countries?
Did you say how can Israel strike back and not show weakness?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's good. I can't see you, Shayna, but it's good to hear your voice. Hope you're doing well since the trip. But the reality is that, you know, Israel's got a hell of a lot to juggle at the moment, and I don't believe that it's a weakness to go along with this ceasefire. You know, Israel does have to concern itself with international opinion, as well as its own survival and the protection of its own people, which have to come top. But you know, there's a huge number of things affected by Israel's international relations, obviously including trade and the prosperity of the country, plus military support for Israel, particularly US weapons and munitions provided. So Israel does have to bear that in mind. It also has to bear in mind its relations with Arab states under the Abraham Accords, which are, you know, potentially could be endangered, although most Arab countries hate Islamic Jihad and Hamas as much as Israel does. But Israel does have to take account of that. And I think, you know, I think it's a real balancing act, because it's not just Gaza. Gaza is a problem, but it's not the main problem for Israel. The main problem for Israel is Iran, not only its nuclear threat, but what it's doing in Syria to try and build a base of operations there. So Israel has a finite military capability. It's strong, very powerful, but it does have to consider all of the different threats from all around it. And therefore can't afford to be overcommitted in somewhere like Gaza. So it's a real balancing act, I think. And it's not, I don't envy the Prime Minister of Israel in having to take these decisions, because many people here say, and I've spoken to many people here in the last few days who are saying, well, we should go and smash the hell out of the whole thing and take it over again. But to take over Gaza again would mean a vast military investment and financial investment. And Israel doesn't need that at the moment. And then there are other people, of course, who support what Israel's doing, and yet others who think Israel shouldn't be carrying out any military strikes at all. So it's got external relations and internal relations to worry about.
Max, it's your turn. And if you could be on camera, that would be great as well.
Yep. Okay. So now that Islamic Jihad is kind of temporarily gone because their leadership has been taken out, what's going to happen to everyone else? Is it more likely that they're going to completely dissolve and be gone, be incorporated and assimilated into a different organization, reform, and make a new leadership later down the line, or how do you foresee it happening?
Before I answer the question, Matt, can you give us a quick tune on the piano?
It is not next to me right now.
Okay, I'll let you off then. Right. Well, Islamic Jihad has not been destroyed. It still exists. It's still a viable terrorist entity. The leadership has been chopped off, but undoubtedly there are other people who have stepped up into those roles now. Whether they're as effective or more effective or less effective, we don't know. But Islamic Jihad is not going to be rolled into any other organization. It's going to continue to exist. It's going to rebuild itself. It's going to do its best to rearm so that it can either strike it again or join in a Hamas strike if that occurs, and a Hamas attack if that occurs. So that's not really on the cards at the moment. I think one of the fallouts from this might be Islamic Jihad trying to exert itself again in Judea and Samaria, as it has before, and as it still is doing. But places like Jenin in particular are their strongholds, and the Palestinian Authority security organizations can't control them, so Israel has to. That's why Israel's been going into Jenin and other places like that, Hebron, etc. Basically, they're likely to try and intensify again their attacks there. But the Israeli operations by Shabak and the IDF in Judea and Samaria, in the Islamic Jihad strongholds, have been very effective in the last few months. So they might not have any success there either. Either way, they're going to continue to exist as an organization, and Iran will make sure they do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next two people are Irene and then Joey Carlin. So Irene Dupkin, please, the floor is yours. But you are muted,
Okay. So, hello. Hi, Richard. Thank you for having us, for letting us know the information. So I have a question about the people from Gaza and Arab, like Palestinian Arabs from Gaza and from Judea and Samaria. So it seems like they fully support Hamas and fully support any attack on Israel. Is it really so, in your opinion, or they just need to show that they support in order not to be seen like traitors in their society? So,
sorry, you broke up a bit. Could you repeat the first part of that question?
Okay, so Palestinian Arabs from Gaza and from Judea and Samaria, do they really support anti-Israel attacks by Hamas and by, I don't know, by jihad, by Islamic Jihad, or they just need to show that they support so they don't be considered traitors in their society?
It's a mixture of the two, as you probably expect. Some of them are fervent supporters of Islamic Jihad, Hamas, etc. And many of them believe that their place is not in Gaza, their place is in the rest of Israel. They've all got keys to different places in Israel, and they want to go back there. And they think that that Hamas and Islamic Jihad are going to pave the way for that. Of course, they're not, but that's what they think. And many of these people have been brainwashed ever since they were born, as they have in Judea and Samaria. So it's just the way they think in many cases. Other people in Gaza will not like it, but they can't really speak out. They can't do anything. They're so tightly controlled. They can't really say anything, but they don't like it. And one thing that is worth being aware of is that 15,000 people from Gaza have permits to leave Gaza each day or each week and come across and work in Israel. And their livelihood depends on being able to get into Israel, and they can't do it while a conflict's going on. So, that's another big lever, I think, in Gaza. But the answer is it's a mixture of both, and there's been a huge amount of brainwashing going on. And these people really do believe in some cases that Islamic Jihad and Hamas are going to get them back into what they think is their rightful homes. None of them have ever lived in Israel before, but they think they have a home there.
Great. We have Joey Carlin, and then there was I missed a question in the chat from Ms. Catherine Wolf, so that will be second. Mr. Joey Carlin, you are up next.
Hi, Colonel. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak today. So my question is with regard to the Abraham Accords. So now that Israel has many, or hopefully more in the future, many relationships with Muslim and Arab countries, and these are, good or at least neutral relationships. is it possible that in the future, some of these countries could turn against Israel and then use these relationships to possibly put pressure on Israel in such times of distress? And what would that look like to Israel, and what might Israel's response to that be?
It's a good question, Joe. Before I answer it, did you have a good fast?
Yes, I did. Thank you.
Good, glad to hear it. I wasn't able to fast, as we're at war here and we're absolved from fasting when there's a time of conflict. But anyway, yeah, to your question, the reality is that those countries that have signed up for the Abraham Accords and other countries in the Middle East really do support Israel, and they don't like Hamas, they don't like Islamic Jihad. And the prospects of them putting pressure on Israel, I think, are relatively remote in this circumstance. And the circumstance in which Israel has to carry out a strike or a series of strikes against Lebanon or against Iran, or both at the same time, probably. I think the most Arab countries fear Iran enormously and see Israel as their ally. So if Israel carries out military operations against any of those countries, or indeed Syria as well, which it does regularly and frequently, then I don't think there's any prospect of those countries trying to put pressure on Israel. They might sometimes, and they sometimes do, as they did in the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva a few weeks ago. They speak out against Israel and they condemn Israel, but it's talk, it's not reality. So I think the answer is that it's not going to happen. But if it did happen, the second bit of your question was, what would Israel do? I think, well, Israel would obviously, they have close relations with these countries and would negotiate and talk them down. Or if not, they'd still do it anyway, because these countries can't really have an influence on what's going on. And Israel's number one priority is protecting its own people. So these are not going to really influence, I don't think, the extent that Israel feels it needs to carry out operations against terrorists who threaten its people. So I think one point I would make, though, not part of your question, but I think the Abraham Accords, and I mentioned this to some people who were over here when we had the trip. The Abraham Accords, I think, best possibility for this to stop. If the Abraham Accords are expanded, if Saudi joins it officially, which I think it will in due course, etc., I think that will isolate Palestinian leadership even more than they are now, and will probably, potentially could lead to them coming to accommodation with Israel. I'm not overly optimistic about that, but it's a possibility. I think if the Abraham Accords expand and grow and develop, as I hope they will, then that could possibly be an outcome.
Thank you. We have a question from Ms. Catherine Wolf. If you want to speak it, or I can read your question. It's a very good question, actually.
I hope it's not a difficult question.
It's actually very important. I think it's a great question. I'll read it. The question is as follows. Colonel Kemp, do you think the American and European media have been rather mild toward Israel this time around as compared to other flare-ups? And if so, why might that be?
I haven't really been following international media that closely. I've looked at some of it, but I was talking today to the IDF spokesperson's department, and they believe that it's been less savage than it has in the past. And I think there are probably two reasons for that. One is that this conflict didn't go on for very long. It's only about 2 to 3 days, a very short time really compared to other conflicts in Gaza. Therefore, they haven't really had the time to build up momentum. And for example, I've been talking to a few UK media, newspapers and TV recently who haven't sent people out. They normally send squadrons of people out to come and join in the Attack Israel Fest, but they haven't done so this time because it was unexpected. There wasn't really much of a build up to this, and it lasted such a short time. So I think that's one reason. Although there has been a lot of vitriol in the media, some of the stuff I've seen has been very, very damning against Israel, as we'd expect. I think the other reason is Ukraine. There's much more interest in international media in what's going on in Ukraine than in Israel or Israel and Gaza. And there's vastly more casualties. And indeed, the casualty rate, although all these, certainly not terrorist casualties, but civilian casualties are obviously a tragedy, but they're caused by Islamic Jihad. They're not caused by Israel. they're caused by Islamic Jihad, but actually there's been a relatively small number. I suspect that, you know, a good day in Chicago probably would yield more deaths than has been caused in Israel, in Gaza throughout this conflict.
Thank you.
Great. Yeah, Kinneret, please, you're next. And I think we're going to take maybe 1 or 2 more questions because I want to be mindful that Colonel Kemp is going into midnight. So I want to be mindful of his time.
I don't mind. I'll be here as long as you want me.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Colonel Kemp, for doing this with us. This is amazing. Such a great opportunity. My question is, these Islamic jihadists, are they born and bred in Gaza and just influenced or sent info or whatever from as a proxy, or is there traveling going on between Iran and Gaza? And that's my first part of the question. The second part is, would Israel carry out, you a little bit touched upon it, but would they carry out military, you know, covert operations in Iran to cut off more heads of this organization?
Yeah, I think there is an element of movement, but it's relatively limited. Most of the terrorists involved are in Gaza, and that's where they stay. It's very hard for them to come and go from Gaza, but of course they do sometimes, but it's limited. As far as attacks on Iran, Israel has been conducting a large, or allegedly, and you know they haven't acknowledged it, of course, but allegedly carrying out a range of attacks against Iran, sabotage, assassination, cyber attacks, and others, mainly directed at the nuclear program. The leadership of Islamic Jihad is not really in Iran. They obviously do have representatives in Iran, and I mentioned before that their overall leader has been in Iran for the last few days, but is normally in Syria. I would be surprised if Israel doesn't look at action against their leaders anywhere they might be. And there are obviously Islamic Jihad leaders in Syria, in Lebanon, and other countries. And in the Middle East, it's such a dangerous place that accidents, unfortunately, do happen sometimes. And I wouldn't be at all surprised in the coming, the coming weeks and months if a few Islamic Jihad leaders in other countries don't meet with very, very unfortunate accidents.
You should participate, Yvonne. You got.
What's he talking about?
Oh, sorry, please mute yourself.
What's going on in Israel now?
Excuse me. Can
Israel killed, I guess.
Sorry, Colonel Kemp, I'm looking.
Well, at least we know people are listening, right?
That is true, but I am looking for culprit. Please mute yourself. Sorry, Colonel Kemp, apologies. Please continue. Well, now you're muted, Colonel Kemp.
Right. I hope I'm not muted now. Did you hear the answer to the question?
Partly. I think you were still concluding.
Okay, I was just really saying that unfortunate accidents could befall Islamic Jihad leaders anywhere in the Middle East and possibly in the world, if they happen to walk into a bomb or a bullet or something like that. It would be unfortunate.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody have any other questions? I have one last question, which is, what is I know you can't divulge state secrets, and as much as I would like you to tell us a little bit, but what is the mood, not just among Israeli citizens, but among Israeli generals, security? What is the mood in terms of this conflict versus what happened a year ago in May?
Well, I think both of them, the general mood among people in, shall we say, authority over here, the general view, I think, is that both conflicts were successful. Obviously, success, you need to define success, but they both did severe damage to the terrorists that were trying to kill them. And at the same time, thanks largely to Iron Dome and the shelter system and the warning system, they did protect the lives of all Israeli civilians in this case, and last time of the vast majority. So I think it's seen as a success. And and this one, I think in particular, is probably regarded as being more successful because it didn't last very long, and the length of a conflict does define people's view of its success, because of course, the longer these conflicts go on, the more damaging they are to Israel economically as much as anything else. So yeah, I think one observation I would make is that this, I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first time ever that Israel's carried out a large-scale preemptive attack against Gaza. And I suspect that the success of that attack and the fact that there hasn't been that much, or there's been a lot, but not as much as you might expect, international condemnation or pressure from countries like the US to stop it, I think that might maybe make IDF and Israeli politicians consider the chance of doing another preemptive attack at the right point. They haven't done so up to now. And I was talking to a couple of senior officials in the days before this operation began, asking their view as to whether it was going to be kicked off. And they were firmly of the view that Israel just does not do a preemptive attack, certainly not in recent years. So that was the common view, that Israel only responds to attacks on itself. It doesn't preempt them, and that's, to a large extent, that's for international relations reasons. But I think this might have given them, an idea that they could carry out preemptive attacks more effectively in the future. And one of those might be, one occurrence might be in South Lebanon. I think, the sabers are being rattled a lot in South Lebanon by Hezbollah at the moment, and they might decide, I don't know, but they might decide to carry out a preemptive strike there before they start getting missiles coming in from South Lebanon. And although this was not your question, I think it is worth mentioning that, and we haven't touched on it, I didn't discuss it in my initial comments, but yet again, the IDF have taken extreme caution, extreme care in minimizing civilian casualties. And this time, we haven't really seen it before, but you might want to look on IDF social media or the IDF website, or they're very active on Twitter, for example, the IDF, and on Instagram. And they've been publishing videos showing footage from planned attacks that are about to be carried out and then are aborted because there are, for example, children in the area they're planning to attack. And they haven't done that before, but they've done quite a lot of it this time and shown, for example, they've shown a pilot being called off from an attack because his controllers have seen children in the vicinity of the attack location. And there's also, I'll try and find it, and if I can, I'll post it on the Club Z site. I'm glad no one's argued with me about Z yet, but we'll probably get there at some point. But there was a conversation recorded between an Israeli security officer speaking to a person in one of the buildings in Gaza and telling him to make sure everyone was out of the building, everyone was clear. And it was published on video, and it's very interesting. We know this goes on all the time. They're constantly phoning on mobile phones. They're constantly phoning Arabs up in Gaza and warning them to get out. But they haven't before published a conversation, so I'm sure I'll be able to find it and put it on. I would suggest you listen to it because it's interesting. Yeah, and the other point on that front is that the media have been talking about how indiscriminate attacks by Israel, and it's not as precise as they like to pretend and all that sort of thing. But there's been footage also, there's photographs been published showing the media filming buildings that are about to be hit and are being hit. So that shows that they're just lying about what they've been saying about Israel, because they're sufficiently confident. They're not interested in getting killed. So they're happy to go near a building that they know is about to be struck and film it.
Okay, I want to be mindful of mostly your time, but also this is the midday for people at work. And I just want to thank you, really. And I want you to all to understand that Colonel Kemp has asked that this be exclusive to Club Z. So we did not market this to anyone outside of Club Z. This was only for Club Z, basically families, teens, parents. So we really are getting a very, very up close and personal briefing from Israel, from an expert in national security. I do see, Natalie, Maxine, your question, right, about Egypt? Is that why you're? No? Okay. So thank you so much, Colonel Kemp. Always, by the way, our most recent Instagram explainer is really thanks to Colonel Kemp, who gave me basically all the answers. Why did Israel strike first? Who is PIJ? What do they have to do with Hamas? And you were really instrumental in helping to arm social media, Club Z social media, with the truth. So I want to thank you so, so much for this, Colonel Kemp. And of course, we're going to call on you again. This is not the end. This is only the beginning.
Thank you very much, Naya, and thank you for everyone who listened. And I hope I didn't bore you too much. And there were some outstanding questions. So thanks for them. And if you have any other questions for me, then please ask if on this or any other topic. And I can be contacted either through the WhatsApp group or via Naya or whatever, however you want to do it, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for your time. And of course, thank you, Colonel Kemp. And thank you, Club Z.
Thank you, Colonel.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Colonel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Colonel Kemp.
Bye, Colonel. Talk to you soon. Thanks.
I hope so.
Thank you, Colonel.
Bye.
Wonderful presentation. Great briefing.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.